Hello, I'm Joshua of Milestone Play. Today, I wanted to take a look at something a little bit more esoteric when it comes to role-playing games. Over the last handful of years, role-playing games have very much skyrocketed in their growth across how many people know about them and what people expect out of them. Not only are they good for good, lighthearted fun, but there's entire industries built around their entertainment. Additionally, people have started spanning from ages 3, 4, 5, all the way up to geriatric, playing these games for many different reasons. Some people play them to help teach their kids addition, subtraction, cooperation, communication skills. Other people use role-playing games in therapy to help break through different issues. Even not in a professional sense, I know many people that will use their games to help better themselves in different aspects of life. Whether that's overcoming social anxiety, as I use the games, or for getting to mess with small little topics, get to play with them in a safe spot, role-playing games are excellent for bettering ourselves. I wanted to take some time today to explain my understanding of why role-playing games are so good at letting us better ourselves. I hope you'll join me. Welcome back. So before we get into my in-depth explanation of how I believe role-playing games to function in bettering ourselves, I do want to let you know where I'm pulling my information from. I'm going to be combining information from two different sources today. This is my interpretation of this information, so I do welcome you to go and read these items for yourselves. The first thing I will be pulling on is J.R.R. Tolkien's lecture on fairy stories. Tolkien is widely known throughout the fantasy genre communities as the originator of The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, and really the man who gave us many of the tropes that a lot of fantasy falls back on today. Besides that, though, he was also one of the first critics of modern fairy stories, or, as we will learn, really just fantasy in general. Not all fairy tales fall under these same definitions, and not all fantasy stories that you might think of as a fantasy story also fall under. He is defining a very specific idea, but it is very useful for us today. The second source I'm going to be using is the Rites of Passage by an ethnographer, Arnold van Gennep. Now, there are many other scientists that have explained rites of passage in different contexts. I am personally using the ethnographer van Gennep as my history, my experience is in anthropology. You can find other sources of this in psychology and sociology. All of those are also wonderful resources to look into, but my own experience does come in through anthropology and Van Gennep. So, those links should be down below in the doobly-doo if you want to read on them yourselves. But for now, we're going to get into our first section, which is going to be Tolkien's characteristics, requirements of fairy stories. To help us break down Tolkien's 4 characteristics of fairy stories, we're going to be using the acronym FERC. Now, FERC stands for Fantasy, Escape, Recovery, Consolation. As we're going through those, some of these you will be able to easily tie into role-playing games. Some of them you might have a little bit more trouble. That's why I'm here. So the very first thing that we're going to look at that a fairy story requires is going to be fantasy. Now, fantasy is a very big term for us. Tolkien has a very simple definition of what fantasy is, and that definition is anything beyond what is mundane to our world. This can be anything from as simple as a talking dog all the way up through giant, unknown worlds to explore. Anything that is different from our own is fantasy. Now, Tolkien believes that fantasy is natural to humans, that we very easily fall into creating these things for ourselves. So, very broad term, any role-playing game can really fall into this. However, as we go a little bit deeper, he does have a distinction that will begin to weed out a lot of different stories that you might think of as fantasy stories. Just because they don't fall in his definition of fantasy doesn't mean that they're not, but it does give us a better idea, and it actually helps us define how role-playing games help us become better. The distinction here is a primary world versus a secondary world. The primary world is our own. They're really, depending how you look at it, depending on your philosophies, there is one primary world. It is the one that we go about our lives in. The important part of fantasy is the secondary world. It is another place. It is Middle-earth. It is the worlds of Skyrim and Tal'Dorei and all these other places. The important part, though, is that they are true. They are true worlds. They themselves contain everything that is their existence. This truth is what separates fantasy fairy stories from other types of narratives. This takes away traveler tales, this takes away beast tales, and this takes away dream stories. A traveler tale would be something like Jonathan Swift's Gulliver Travels, where you have someone from a very real interpretation of our world. We're supposed to believe that Gulliver is a real person who went off on this adventure and encountered fantasy elements. This also includes C.S. Lewis's Narnia. We have a very real setting of early 20th century Britain that the children then go through the wardrobe and travel to another place. This excludes that because there is some element of our real world, and then we have an addition to it. Additionally, beast tales like Aesop's Fables, Peter Rabbit, these things are not exactly what Tolkien means by having a secondary world. It's just a reinterpretation of our own. Finally, this excludes dream stories, things like Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, where in the end, Alice didn't go anywhere. It was all a dream. It's things that aren't actually real. They're not true in the story. Now, for role-playing games, many role-playing games are based on having this true other place. Whether you're playing Dungeons & Dragons and living in the world of the Forgotten Realms, Eberron, Greyhawk, Dark Sun, I mentioned Exandria, Tal'Dorei earlier, all of these places are true. We do not expect the United States, Great Britain, Egypt, China, Japan, we don't expect any parts of these histories to be actually real in these stories. We may use them as touch points, we may use them to explain, but in the core world, they are separate. Now, there are some role-playing games where you may think, oh, this isn't really a secondary world. One of those might be something like any Call of Cthulhu-based game, where you take a real time period, a real place, and then you layer the Lovecraftian mythos over it. I would argue that those are also secondary worlds, and the reason for that is the mythos is treated as having always been true. As long as humans have been around, that mythos has been true, and then a lot of the game, a lot of the story, and even the mechanics of Call of Cthulhu games play into the fact that people in that world are having to deal with the aspect that these things have always been true. So, that is fantasy that's first on our list. Having just some element of the mystical permeating through the entirety of the story, a part of the game, a part of what we are doing. Moving on from fantasy, we move on to escape. Now, we have spoken, I say we in general, the subculture of role-playing game enthusiasts, have spoken about escape and escapism at everywhere. Escapism is a major part of why a lot of people play these games. For Tolkien, escape is purely based off of the first element, based off of fantasy. The fact that we are able to create fantasy allows for us to escape into it, allows for us to leave our own concerns, leave our own problems, our daily lives, and move off to this other place. And escape is key for Tolkien when it comes to fairy stories about these splendorous things. It is important to note that Tolkien very much views escape as a very big positive. Tolkien does not believe that escape is deserting reality, that escape helps us as people. It's a very extreme idea, but he takes the example of having a prisoner in a cell cinder block walls all around. And in that case, whatever sentence this prisoner is serving, whatever crimes he has committed, that escape is what is going to allow him to get through this experience, to learn from it, to get to the other end and still be a person. This escape is very important for us. Moving on from escape, we get to recovery. Recovery is what happens when we come back from reading a fairy story, when we come back from playing a role-playing game. Recovery is the ability to come back to the primary world with the knowledge and experience of the secondary. If you are in Middle-earth and you go into Mirkwood, you go to Lothlorien, you go to these wonderful places in forests, in glens and dales, and you see magic happen there. You see the enchantment, you see the luster, you see the fairy lights. When we come back to the primary, rather than being upset that our own forests, our own woods aren't these things, we are able to bring those elements and be able to look at wonder at our real world, to better appreciate our real world, the ability to see potential there that we may have forgotten. When we are children, imagination is such a big part of us, and as we grow up, there are different societies, different cultures that begin to wean that out of us as we grow. And part of telling these stories, whether it's fairy tales or part of playing these games, is being able to recapture that light, that joy, that wonder, that enchantment, and see it in our everyday lives, and to improve our everyday lives through it. The final portion of our 4 characteristics is our consolation. Consolation is a tenderness. It is a caring for. In this case, the consolation could either be moral or emotional. At the end of many, many fairy stories, it's almost a requirement depending how you look at fairy stories. At the end, there is a good thing that happens. The knight slays the dragon. The princess is saved. There is a wedding. All of these wonderful things happen. The tyrant is overthrown. Robin Hood, where we can kind of look at this as a fairy story, overthrows Prince John. The good King Richard, our story version of King Richard, maybe not historical, comes back and rules the land justly. These are all good things. They may make us feel good, or they may show us that whatever troubles are happening in our lives, that there is a moral good that comes of this. These big moments that happen at the end of fairy stories, and many times in role-playing games, they don't have to, but many times at the end of role-playing games, Tolkien coins as a eucatastrophe. A catastrophe is a sudden turning, where the world is suddenly upended upon itself. A eucatastrophe, coined by Tolkien, taking the Latin root eu for good, is a good catastrophe as opposed to a discatastrophe. And a eucatastrophe is the sudden change for good, where all of a sudden something that was not expected turns out for the right. In Tolkien's own work of The Lord of the Rings, after Frodo has gone through the giant trial of getting the One Ring to Mordor, to Mount Doom, he has dealt with Smeagol and Gollum with as much mercy as he can. He treats him as best as he can, even at the expense of Sam. That good then comes back, and when Frodo falls to the influence of the ring, it is Gollum, it is Smeagol, it is this creature that ends up actually bringing the ring down into the fires. This sudden turn from little seeds earlier in the story allows for everything to turn out well in the end. Part of this is a celebration. It is the wonders that are capable in our world and the things that we need to experience to maintain an optimism. Tolkien believed that the eucatastrophe was not necessarily a deus ex machina, that it is an optimistic view of the world and that, if properly used, can channel through from small seeds early on to a justified ending that for everyone on the good side, for you, for me, for those playing the games, for those reading the stories, that we find ourselves in a better state at the end of it. Okay, now that we have our characteristics, requirements of fairy tales, of fantasy, of fairy stories, all these things, and I have applied them to different aspects of role-playing games, I now want to take a look at Arnold van Gennep's Rites of Passage. Now, Rites of Passage are these ceremonies that allow for us to move from one group into another. Within culture, within society, we tend to break people up into different stages. Now, this can be something like aging, where you are a youth, you go through a coming-of-age ceremony, you become an adult, you eventually get married, you go from one person to a couple as society sees you as linked together. You have that sort of progression. You have progressions that go through the steps of birth and death, both before those events occur and after, and how society and cultures deal with those processes. These can be through professional careers, whether it's joining into a military organization, going through higher education, going through technical training, apprenticeships, journeymanships, up through into being a master. All of these processes have moments that mark the transition from one phase to another. Whatever those transitions look like, whatever those ceremonies, whatever those processes look like, they fall into what Van Gennep dictates are the rites of passage. The rites of passage are separated out into the rites of separation, rites of liminality, and rites of reincorporation. With that, each of these processes do have a series of those events. So we're going to look at what those are in order. The rites of separation are those rites that bring us away from our previous station in life. When it comes to something like joining into the military, you go through training, you go through boot camp, you have all these things, but part of the rites of separation, depending on the military you're joining, might be something like, for males in certain situations, having their hair cut. And that is a group thing that all the cadets go through, and it is a cutting away of who they used to be. It is very much a symbolic gesture. There are practical means for it. However, as these things have developed over ages, they gain these different symbolisms to them, as there's many different cultures that have the cutting of hair as being a process of going from one position into another. You then have the rites of liminality. The rites of liminality are a very ambiguous phase. It is those moments where you are not part of one group, but you're not part of the other either. As this goes through, these different situations tend to allow for a bit more exuberance in the transitional phase. Going away from military, let's go over to something like a marriage. Whether you have two grooms, two brides, a bride and a groom, tends to be that you have a separation of the two individuals involved. You separate, you go through your preparations, those are the rites of separation, and then the ceremony itself for a wedding tends to be the liminal phase, the rites of liminality. And it is in those phases that you go through, you make your oaths, you exchange rings, possibly, maybe other objects. If you are a religious individual, perhaps you have some form of doctrine read, and this is all done with just the two individuals, possibly a small select group around them, and everyone else watching from a distance. After you have these rites of liminality, we go into the rites of incorporation. The incorporation is when you come back to the group. It's when you have your reception at your wedding. It is when you go through boot camp, you graduate, and then you are represented to family as being a part of the military, and then you go and you serve that role. During the rites of passage, a lot of these things can involve an exuberance to them, as I mentioned before, because within this ambiguous nature of who you are, what group you are a part of, you are allowed to do things you otherwise aren't allowed to do. You are shedding burdens, you are shedding prohibitions from the previous group, but you have not yet accepted the new obligations of the new group. And it is in this celebration that others tend to come and they join you, and they allow for a unique experience, unlike other parts of the continuity of the cultures that are present. So now, we have these two different aspects. We have the characteristics of fairy tales, of fairy stories, of fantasy, and we have the rites of passage. I believe that these two units brought together allow role-playing games to better our lives, to have us take role-playing games and better ourselves through them. So, taking the top of the stack, we're going to look at fantasy and escape. Now, these two are heavily linked through Tolkien, because he believes that it is the act of fantasy that allows for us to escape. It is this escape, this leaving our mundane lives, that is the rites of separation from our rites of passage. The separation, the leaving who we are as people and going off to this fantasy world to slay dragons, barter with bandits, gain renown, have power where you may not have power at other stations. This leaving away of self allows for us to begin processes of change. From there, most of a role-playing game session is the space of liminality. It is where you are going through, you are doing things that you otherwise wouldn't be doing. You are pretending to be another person, yes. You are taking on an aspect of someone else who might be more confident, who might be more clever, who might act sooner than you otherwise would. They're not as patient, or perhaps they're not as reserved, and you are practicing acting sooner than you otherwise would, not thinking too long on something. All of this falls under the rites of liminality, where we are separated from ourselves. From there, we have the reincorporation, the incorporation, and we have our recovery and our consolation. And as we come back to ourselves, as we come back to our daily lives, we have to go to work, we might have to go tend to the garden, we have bills to pay, we have all these different things. As we come back, we can take the recovery, and when we reincorporate, when that all comes together, we can take that confidence, we can take that willingness to act, we can take patience, we can take cleverness, we can take practices, whether it's how we speak to people, how we view ourselves, and bring those back into our life. And within the recovery of Tolkien, we can then see ourselves that way, and we can take the practice that we have had in that time in liminality and bring it into our lives and make our lives more of what we want them to be. We have this consolation, we have this eucatastrophe. Not all role-playing games, every session, are going to end with things being grand, better, but there is this progression towards better. During a game, whether it's a one-shot, a campaign, you are moving towards an ending that you want. And as we move towards that, and as we come out of every single session, we are seeing ourselves better and better in small ways. It may not be eucatastrophic, it might be a sudden change, but when we get to the end of the story, when we are at Mount Doom, when we are at the moments that we think we may not be able to be that person we want to be, we can look back at all those small moments of kindness, of mercy that Frodo showed Smeagol. And possibly when Gollum comes up, that we have that catastrophic moment of having all those moments, we find ourselves a different person. Now, these are pretty big ideas. I recognize that. I have taken some liberties with both the characteristics and the rights. I do encourage you to read the different articles below, go through and find the information about these subjects and judge for yourself. However, with the amount that role-playing games have been uplifted, the amount that they're being used to teach, to learn, to grow, this is my interpretation of why that works. We don't have to be therapists. We don't have to be self-help. We don't have to be self-help experts. We have so much practice reading fairy stories. We have so much practice going through, watching media. We know this intrinsically. Whether or not we know the words, we know the feelings, we know the gestures. And in having these gestures, having this in us, very natural to us, how we are as people, the rites of passage just naturally occur. We go through, we see ceremonies, we see rituals, we see the transitions of phases of people. And whether or not we are intentionally playing role-playing games to be better ourselves, we just are. Thank you.